I've been part of IC3 for, well, really since its founding. My name is Clay Hensley. I am on the IC3 board. I also represent a number of organizations that are here as thought partners today, including CIALFO, who many of you may have heard of. I also work with NACAC, the National Association of College Admission Counseling, and Cambridge International Examinations. And I work with Northeastern as well. We have an incredible panel, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. But first, I want to learn a little bit about you, to give us a little bit of context before we launch this discussion. And just to make sure that you're in the right place, our title is Flavors of Global Admissions on the screen, what is needed and what is not. So we'll be talking about trends in international admissions. So just, you can still take off if this is not the right subject for you. But I guarantee you're in for a very good discussion. So raise your hand how many counselors do we have in the room? Those that are school-based counselors, okay? And how many of you are from higher ed institutions? Okay, and how many of you are from peer organizations, not-for-profits working in the space? Okay, welcome. And to give a sense of geography, how many of you are from India or other parts of South Asia? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you are based outside of South Asia? Okay, so we're wonderful. Welcome, everyone. And I'm now going to ask, as part of our discussion, I want my panel to give a short elevator pitch or short journey to give you context related to how they came to be here. And I have to remind myself who we were going to start with, but since Alex is right next to me, I'm going to tell Alex to start.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being part of our session today. My name is Alex Alvendia-Winkers. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Admission at Rice University, located in Houston, Texas. I am brand new to the team. I joined in June of 2022, so I'm definitely leaning on experience that predates Rice University. I was formerly at University of Southern California, USC, in Los Angeles, California for about 8 years before joining Rice, where at USC I was overseeing all international admission for the university, which was about 13,000 undergraduate students in the application pool, and a large chunk of those in the admitted class as well. My journey to higher education, USC and Rice, has been obviously twists and turns in the international space. I think the volatility of our market says a lot about kind of the work that we are doing in this. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of kick off kind of my contributions to today's session is really this idea of the roles that I've moved into and transitioned have been, associate director or director of admission now. And I don't necessarily sometimes see my role as director of admission, more of like director of change management, and how the world is constantly changing and how I have to manage that both internally with my team, but of course how we communicate that with the various stakeholders that we all work with, whether it be parents, students, of course, you all, as well as the general public who, for a place like Rice, a place like USC, there's a lot of interest in what we're doing as institutions around international students. And so there's a lot of kind of scrutiny on the types of work that we're doing. So happy to start this conversation around that. And should I, Satya, next?
Let's do that.
Good morning. I'm Satyajit Dattagupta. I'm currently the Chief Enrollment Officer and Senior Vice Chancellor at Northeastern University. Before that, I was Dean of Admission at Tulane. Prior to that, Director of Admission at Rochester. But the thing that brings me here today is actually I was born in Mumbai, India, and I went to the States when I was 17 years old. I went to one of the biggest public schools in Mumbai, Jai Hind College, and I used to run around as a headless chicken at the age of 17, trying to find someone to help me to go abroad. So this IC3 movement is something that's very close to my heart, something that I care about deeply. You can't hear me? Can you hear me better now? Okay, sorry. So just happy to be here today, answer questions, and talk about, from my vantage point, our vantage point, what's happening in international admissions. It's an area of passion for me because of my own journey and working for an institution that has a massive global outreach. It really aligns with my own personal values. So happy to be here today and looking forward to chatting with you. See a lot of familiar faces, so thank you.
Candice.
Good morning. My name is Candace Aldrich. I am representing the University of St. Andrews, which is in Scotland. I am from America, if you're worried about my accent. You're saying that that's not British. I have been obsessed with Scotland since I was a teenager. My father was a professor. He took me over. I did my master's at the University of Edinburgh in International and European Politics. Went back, I worked at Duke in international programming, couldn't shake the pull. I now live there. I have a Scottish baby. I'm permanent. I've been working with India in India for over 15 years, and I've been the regional manager at University of St. Andrews for India for the last 8 years. I'm like my colleagues here, I'm very passionate about the contextual side and helping students find the right fit and helping them have that transformational experience when they go abroad and the way it broadens their horizons. Neurodivergent, the session we had yesterday in terms of access and inclusion, I champion that for international because a lot of places do it local, but I want that to be something that's available for students to go overseas as well from those deprived or disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's what drives me, that's why I'm here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you today.
Thank you for sharing your personal journeys. You see a theme interwoven there, that all of these folks have had deep international experiences, deep international pathways to get them to leadership positions that have prepared them for this inflection point in terms of admissions, access, enrollment. So they come to it with a great international perspective, and I'm going to highlight that. Also, Alex, I did want to note that, when I've worked with Alex for several years when he was at USC before he came to Rice. And you worked also with governmental agencies, you've worked for startups, and then Satya I've worked with when he was at Rochester and worked under a mentor of mine, John Burdick, as well as at Washington College, and then worked a lot with St. Andrews and particularly friends there, including Candace, but also Beth Shodden. And so in working with these leaders, I know that we're prepared for a great discussion. The way I've structured the discussion, we're going to talk about 3 key topics. And since I have my colleague Encore on the front row, raise your hand, Encore. So if you ever need anything from Cialfo, Encore is the person, your main contact. But Cialfo, many of you may not know, but the name is derived from the first syllables of the Olympic motto. So, and I'm not a Latin major, so I'm not going to try to pronounce each one, but I do know faster, higher, stronger. But the Latin equals Cialfo. And so we're going to structure the conversation based on the faster shifts happening, the changes in decision making. That's going to be our first topic. And then what that means as expectations, as goals, as the number of applications become higher, what is the key response and what do counselors and admission officers need to know about what's next? And then finally, the stronger competition and challenges globally. We're going to center that around these changes. And then we're going to close with open discussion. The Olympic motto actually has changed since Cialfo was founded, and the last Latin phrase means together. So we're going to structure the conversation around that theme together. I'm going to provide just a couple of background notes before we start the discussion. So I'm going to ask that the next slide come up, and one more. So just to give you some context, and this is US-centered. I know we do have a very international audience, and we also have Candace, who represents a UK Scottish university. But I'm going to center the conversation right now on US trends. And international undergraduate enrollment in the US has declined for 2 consecutive years, and we expect a bounce back, but that bounce back is coming with some key caveats. Now, particularly among undergraduate enrollment, graduate enrollment has also declined. Our biggest declines have actually been even more so in short-term study, but you're all concerned about undergraduate, so we're going to concentrate on that. Next slide, please. And a preponderance or a majority of international undergraduate enrollment really comes from only a handful of source countries. This isolates undergraduate. India has only recently emerged as the second biggest source country to the US for undergraduate study. It was one of the few countries that grew during the Trump COVID years. China, which is by far the biggest, almost a third of our undergraduate study, has fallen. as well as other parts of East Asia. One more slide forward, thank you. And then there has what we loosely call a Biden-Harris bounce. It's not all because of the new administration, but there does seem to be a more welcoming stance in the U.S. as well as in other countries. We'll see, Brexit might come up in this conversation, what things are doing in Australia. So geopolitics has had an impact, but we have seen a rebound. Part of it's combined with favorable factors like, say, test optional will come up, but other student-centered policies that have been adopted during the pandemic and other innovations, but also just geopolitical politics being in a better place in the U.S. Next slide. We'll finish. And so now we're on, that gives a bit of a launch pad to go into my first question, which I'm going to pose to Satya. Satya, with all of these rapid convulsions, these shifts related to U.S. and global admissions during COVID, what has been the biggest themes or trends impacting your work at Northeastern, especially to connect international students here in India and beyond? In other words, what has happened and what's the impact and what are you learning?
Yeah, thank you, Clay. So I think the first thing that I remember during the pandemic was I was the Dean of Admission at Tulane, and I remember a president coming to me and all of a sudden saying, what are we going to do without international students? And I think prior to that, there was an assumption that international students will just come, and US universities wouldn't have to adapt to international students as much. But I think during the pandemic, it became very clear that as much as international students need to adapt to US universities need to adapt to international students as well. The first thing that I saw was virtual programming, right? So webinars were an afterthought. It was something that we used to do just, on the side. And we would host those webinars at times that were convenient for US institutions, and international students would have to wake up at 3 a.m. Then we realized that that's not working, so that's something that I know that has really changed, which is how we deliver content. And also the type of content. So what resonates with international students is very different than what would for a domestic student. So I'm seeing a lot more emphasis being put on that. The second thing I think, and this was a silver lining, was policy changes. In 2019, if someone had told me that a majority of US universities would be test optional, I would have shaken my head and said there's no way. But that's one thing we realized, was that if international students have to now travel all over the country and the world to just take a test, this does not make any sense. And if they're going to succeed at US institutions, and if we can gauge their skill set based off of their ICSC, CBSC, ISC, whatever it is that they're taking, we should do that. So that was the other thing, and I think that conversation is continuing. And the third for me was this looking at international students for who they are and not grouping them together and saying, we used to use this word called all internationals. Now I think we see, what does an Indian student need? What does a student from China need? What does a student from Africa need? And I think there's a greater emphasis on meeting students where they are, as opposed to just sort of assuming things. And having been an international student myself, I think that's a step in the right direction. We have a long way to go. And for US specifically, it was very difficult for me during the pandemic because of the, I think, anti-international stance that the Trump government had taken, in making things harder for a population that already has a lot of challenges. So that's something that I'm very pleased to see move in the right direction. So, the pandemic was hard for all of us, but I think that's one silver lining that I see during the pandemic, was that international students got more prominence, and US institutions specifically found a way to meet students where they are as opposed to the other way.
Okay. Well, so to bring in our other two institutions into the conversation, so I've heard a couple of key themes there, so you did an excellent job of outlining those. But one, you used the phrase meeting students where they are. I think the centering on the academic record and really looking at context, which has always been a key piece of both US and I would say Scotland as well. But let's start with Alex. Alex, USC, Rice, you're not on the I-95 corridor, it's a little bit different. But how did you take on, and am I right in that shift of looking at the academic record a little bit more closely?
Yeah, and let me start with USC first, since that's, again, where I have the most robustness around this conversation, was we had structured our review process to be literally 2 factors on the initial review, and kind of how we structured our work. We looked at GPA, and we would convert all international curriculum into a American GPA, and SAT or ACT. And we would start at the top and work our way down. It's a great way to structure work because you're working with, again, kind of the most academically rigorous students and working your way down, right? The idea is you're starting in kind of a target-rich environment and trickling down. But when half of that equation is gone, and there's so much variability in GPA because of grading patterns in different countries, things like that, that was a very big shift in how we started to process and understand applications. And so to Satya's points, we, as an international team, we really had to come to the table and have a conversation around, are we fairly reviewing international students? And I think going test optional, which we were forced to do, I think USC for a long time had really attached itself to the validity around test scores, and we can have there's a whole conversation on that. But the idea that international education can't be quantified in just two factors. And that took a lot of training to be able to go to our dean, our director, the folks reviewing to say, we can't treat international students as a monolith any longer. And yes, I think there's an idea that we want to be mindful of, of the variances between international students, but when enrollment leaders, now myself, are looking at just spreadsheets of data around what does the incoming class look like, you lose the nuance and the texture of international context. And so this was a great opportunity for us to recenter the conversation around the academic records in a way that I think was a more student-centered focus versus let's boil this down to how we're going to structure our review process. And let me be honest here, and Julie, one of my colleagues at USC, former colleagues at USC, we did use holistic contextual review there, but when you have 75,000 students, you got to start somewhere. There's only so much time in a day to have your staff dedicate their time, and so if the idea is let's start where we think we're going to get most of our admitted students from, it's kind of at the top. And again, SAT, ACT scores is a good way to filter that. American GPAs are another way to filter that. And so yeah, I think the change in test optional really did force places like USC to really start to think about this through the lens of what is the curricula and where do we kind of structure our process around that. So we started to look at kind of IB, AP, A-levels, CBSE, national curriculum in streams versus simply just one monolithic kind of applicant pool.
And Candice, I would love for you to talk about differences in your review process, but also another thread that I want to pull on, which Satya started, was the geopolitical, and kind of an elephant in the room, Trump. And even though Scotland's different, I get it, but Brexit, I'm sure, did impact some of the things you're doing. So I would love for you to kind of expand on that.
Absolutely. That was the main thing that came to my mind because of where we're located. Brexit has had a huge impact on the diversity of our intakes, both in terms of nationality and socioeconomic, because any student from Europe could access education, higher education in the UK until 18 months ago, and now they can't. Now, they can, but that socioeconomic shift is happening. And what the trend that we're looking at, what a lot of the UK institutions are looking at, is that diversification, because we had the main markets. We had China and we had India, and those are the bulk of the international students coming in. And with COVID, as you've described, what if they don't come? What if none of them can come? What are we going to do? And so there's a whole conversation happening in the UK right now about diversifying that, both because of the benefit in the teaching experience and the learning environment on campus, but as well as to not have all our eggs in one basket, and trying to diversify so that we are not only, again, going to places that are a little less typical, but also making sure we're not exposed because of geopolitical issues. And we did see an impact with the Trump administration, and then the rebound from that with the Biden administration in terms of where students overall felt like they would be welcome and comfortable, and how that's impacting the decisions on their study destinations now. We saw the same thing with our reintroduction of post-study work visa in the UK. A lot of you probably know we had it. It was taken away. That sends an implied message, or whether it was intentional or not. Now it's back, and so it's a process.
So that
it's
signaling became important. And I think I see a lot of, or several U.S. admission officers in the room. This is probably less interesting to counselors from India, but I know that St. Andrews has been successful in creating a pipeline of international students from the U.S. Did you see that increase during these years, or expect? What are some of your strategies there?
Yeah, well, we saw it increase from India too.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we've had bumper crops. We've been doing great. So but I think because of the work with the U.S. and because of understanding the U.S. approach to secondary education, how the transcripts, how you understand the student's progression in addition to test scores, but you also get so much insight from teachers and from counselors, and you get that information on the transcript. You have the school profile, and so you really get a high context picture for each child in terms of what their personal situation was as well as the school situation. So you're really able to make an informed assessment if the university is going to be a right fit and if they're going to succeed while they're with us. And so we've brought a lot of that into every other curriculum from every other country that we work with, especially in India. That's what I've been working on for the last 8 years, to understand, like we do now for the US, how we understand the Indian CBSE, ISE, and the state board curriculums, so that I can look at year 9, year 10, year 11, understand the drop in year 11, predicted in year 12, internal mock exams for year 12, and understand that, and then you also have testing, and you also have boards. And so I've got that full picture. And for all of the UK, as a lot of you know, there's also the personal statement. There's that statement of interest. And that's the other big part for the UK, including Scotland, where it's not just about grades, it's not just about scores. You can be a 99% student, but if your personal statement talks about the beaches in St. Andrews. So it's very much, it's a system, all of the UK is very much a system that it's about the academics. That's why you're going. And so it's just a slightly different approach or a slightly different way of thinking in terms of how you're making your choice and what you want your fit to be.
So context matters, match or fit matters between UK, but particularly Scotland, which is 4 years, and these different types of US institutions. As we close out this section, I want to go back to Satya, because there was one more theme that, and Candace, you and Alex both hit on it, but I heard diversity. And shifts, and the way I have started to think of it, Satya, is a move from the global north to the global south, and India's kind of in between, but where have you seen the biggest shifts from both this region? Have you seen shifts in other places?
In terms of students coming to the States?
Yeah, interest, aspirations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, for us at Northeastern, India has really bounced back the most. This year we have 3,600 Indian students coming to Northeastern. 2,700 of them are graduate, and the rest are undergraduate. But I do think that there's always a desire for students to come to the United States. There's a lot of great things. But we've also seen a rise of students coming from Africa this year for the first time in many years. So I think there's a bounce back that's happening, and I actually think it's good to have diversity in an international population where it's not just students from 2 countries, China and India, dominating the entire international population, because that takes away, I believe, from what an experience should be like. So we've definitely seen that, and I hope that continues.
And some of that is growth of these economies, growth in connections, but I think you guys have all been intentional about outreach to these places as well. Are there, what's a good way to phrase this? Are there approaches that you're taking to increase that diversity intentionally?
One of the things that's coming to mind, and it's part of the IC3 movement, is I think empowering counselors and empowering those who are advising the students.
Okay.
And whether it's a group that's helping to go into the schools to not only upskill teachers and counselors, or it's providing that service for the school, but from what I'm seeing, the students are being encouraged to explore, whereas previously they may not have been. And part of that comes from movement like IC3, from other groups that are making that contact and giving that support so that the students just know their options. And I think there's that increase to try to improve the students' opportunities. And so where we're trying to be purposeful is supporting that. We're a small institution, so we can't take a lot of people. So for us, it is about that quality and it's about supporting the student so they can then make an informed choice. And so we tend to IC3 move in and work with other groups to support the advising.
Okay, and that's a great segue to move on to this next section. So Alex, I think both Rice and USC had bumper crop, I like that term, bumper crop, had higher goals and applications. How did your expectations change for you and your peers during the cycle after that bumper crop?
Oh, yeah. So I'm actually going to start this with a question to the group. How many of you have been in this profession before the pandemic started? So okay. And those of you who started, like, let's say, March of 2020, when it all went sideways, or since then, let's say. Okay, so a handful of people. So this is a good poll then. By show of hands, how many of you feel that you have more energy, are more productive, have more emotional and social capacity to manage your work? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Oh, wow, a few of you. I need to get tips from y'all. How many of you feel that you have less? So less of those things, less time, less energy, less resources to do your job. Yeah, I figured there'd be a few more hands here. And I think this actually is a good segue for me to really talk about how I think about kind of my role at the university in enrollment management. And it's really thinking about the totality of the experience. For me, and my colleague Julie at USC will probably shake her head because I use this example a lot. I think about this in 3 dimensions. I think about this in the self. So what are we doing as people to make sure we have the tools, the resources, and the energy to do our jobs effectively? I think about this from the lens of, does my team, does my office have the learning, the expertise, the resources they need to do to actually manage the work? And then third is actually, does the admission practice, is it doing what it intends to do? And so those are the 3 dimensions I think about when I'm kind of stepping into a new space, both at USC and now at Rice. And so, you know, one of the things, to answer your question, Clay, around expectations, I think I've noticed among more veteran admission professionals, there's kind of been this draw, this attraction back to how we used to do things. And the expectations that we as people, as professionals in this space, have the same energy, the same capacity to produce the same output that we did prior to the pandemic. So to your point around bumper crops, I think this is a great example of a place like USC. We had increases in international apps by 11% and then 26% on tens of thousands of applications. That's sometimes doubling the headcount you would need to effectively get through that work. And so that was a very real challenge because you started to see this bottleneck of the ability for staff members who are already tired, who are already feeling worn out, to be able to effectively do what we all wanted to do, which is to be a highly ethical, highly review process that's grounded in a sense of kind of integrity. And when you start to run into true processes that are breaking down just because of volume, that's a very real challenge that I think as admissions professionals we're facing. So the expectations around ourselves and not giving ourselves enough grace. I think in the pandemic there was this new expectation that we were all giving ourselves and each other a lot more grace and a lot more understanding and just a base level empathy about the world that we're all navigating. And I don't know, I'm a little bit concerned kind of in where I sit now in an organization that we're kind of reverting back to, well, we should have the bandwidth. You should be able to get through, 30,000, 40,000, and at USC, 75,000 applications with no problem. And I don't know if that's actually the reality on the ground. So that's the first dimension. The second one I'll talk a little bit about, just because I think, again, it's important for us to contextualize this, because it really leads into the admission practice, is how does the office have the resources it needs? I'll use Rice as an example. A third of my team are new. I have 11 new staff members, myself included. So think about the institutional knowledge at places like Rice, which is a very, very well-known school, the hemorrhage of knowledge that places like Rice lose when a third of the staff turn over. That's a very real challenge as well. And then I mentioned those things to really talk about how that impacts the admission process and the expectations that I think counselors have of universities ourselves have of each other, is that I think what I can tell you is at a very top level, what hasn't changed is I'm expected to bring in a class. I'm expected to bring in a class that has the right number of students, that's the right composition of students for my particular programs, right? That hasn't changed, right? I think that's the base level. Like, I am succeeding or failing at my job if the class comes in the way that it's supposed to. And of course, all the things that go into that, right? I'm expected to go out and recruit students. I'm expected to go out and make sure my team is able to talk with counselors and engage in these really productive relationships. And again, I'm expected to oversee a process in which, again, there's a highly ethical, highly review process that, again, is grounded in integrity and intentionality and deliberateness. And so all of the pressures I was mentioning before is running up against some of those expectations of this is what I'm expected or our team is expected to do, and sometimes those differences in realities are kind of butt up against each other. And so I mentioned at the very beginning of kind of my intro, the elevator pitch, I think being a director of admission, associate director of international recruitment, I saw my title and I've seen my title more of director of change management, and I think that is still certainly true. I think the last, couple of years, a lot of us were just managing crisis, just putting out fires wherever they were cropping up. I think counselors, you all can appreciate this too, where you never knew what was coming because every day was a new day. And you were just dealing with it as it was, and you just kind of went to bed the next day and were like, all right, let's see what comes up today. And that certainly, I think, is the last couple of years. I think what we're finding now is many of the peers and colleagues that I've talked to, is that we're finally coming out from the haze of the last 2 years, and we're picking up all these plans we had hoped to achieve prior to the pandemic that all look very dusty and very irrelevant because the landscape looks so different. And so we're being asked to implement very wide sweeping initiatives when the variables that kind of were based around those initiatives look very, very different. And so I think that is definitely an expectation that has changed, is we want to be deliberate, we want to be strategic, but the landscape looks so different that actually implementing those strategies is taking a little bit longer than I think some of us had anticipated or want to anticipate. And so I think those are some of the ways in which I think our expectations have changed.
Thank you, Alex. Satya, your portfolio, Alex is delivering a class, you and your team deliver a class, but you have a larger portfolio, student success, international engagement and so forth. Can you talk about some of the data, the insights, as far as how things have shifted for you and what you're using?
Yes, a couple of things that we're looking at in terms of what's shifted. Two things that I would mention. One that we haven't spoken about, but international students, at least prior to the pandemic, were seen as, at least at some institutions, as a major source of revenue, right? So when the revenue was threatened, a lot of people started paying attention. And I'll be very honest with you, I mean, that's really hard for me because I am one of those students. I was one of those students, and on the other side, so the one big thing that from a data standpoint that we're seeing is international students shouldn't just be looked at as a source of revenue. That we should also look at students that come from low-income backgrounds, middle-income backgrounds, and international students that come to America, how their families' need might change while they're there. And that was something that was, we never looked at. And especially during the pandemic, what we saw was a lot of families' incomes went away. And how are they going to complete their degree if we don't increase our aid? So we created, sort of an emergency aid fund, if you will. So that was an interesting element. The other one was the communication between admissions offices and this group. So what happened during the pandemic was, speaking of data, we saw applications go up, which was not predicted from international students. And then acceptance rates, if you talk about, every school now is single digits, right? If you talk about the top 25 institutions, top 40, everyone accepting 6%, 7%, 8%, bragging about it. But on the other hand, what that means is you're denying a lot more students. And yesterday, too, a lot of counselors came up to me and saying, can you give me some data on why you're denying my students? Because I just don't understand. I had a student with a 43 IB and a 1500 SAT that just got a straight deny from your institution, even though they applied ED. So in terms of data, it sort of goes both ways. It's on us, too, to tell counselors and explain to them what we're seeking. But I think the pandemic, some of the communication between students and institutions probably got better, but the guidance counseling community and us, I think that's another relationship that we really have to rebuild, because this wasn't happening, right? We weren't here in person. We were making decisions sometimes in the vacuum, and a lot of decisions were landing in places where people didn't quite understand. So those were the two things that we saw.
And if any of you, so Alex was talking about the sustainability is one thing that came to mind. Satya, you're talking about how there's more ambiguity. You are also, looking at not only allocating more financial aid to support those students, but I know at Northeastern, your co-op program, and in terms of demonstrating ROI, particularly in these new global South markets, so not only South Asia, but ASEAN, Southern Cone, Sub-Saharan Africa, they want to know that there's going to be a return on investment and employability comes in. Would you like to say anything about that before I move on to Candace with a question?
How much time do I have? No, but really, for me, that was, for a lot of families, return on investment became a far more important question in the pandemic. If I'm investing my entire life saving in my child's education, what will they get out of it? And just saying, they'll be happy there is not enough. Or just saying that it's a good fit is not enough. Or just saying that, they'll be safe there wasn't enough. It's what will they get out of it. So the co-op became a very relevant piece of information, which is a guaranteed 6-month employment opportunity for every student. And you really have a chance to get a job at the end of it. Because for a lot of families, going to US isn't always just about getting the education and coming back. For families that come from backgrounds like me, it was about also making a life there. So co-op really resonated with families. ROI became a very important topic, and rightfully so. If you're investing $300,000 to $400,000 in education, what am I getting out of it beyond just the experience and the happiness of my child? Yeah. Will they actually find employment beyond that? And co-op is the best way to do that.
And a fairly high percentage of your students end up in where they intern or where they co-op, end up having jobs. I know we have Evelyn Thimba in the back of the room, and I know Drexel has similar programs, and other institutions are experimenting with that sort of employment-based initiatives. Candace, we're going to move on to that last section, but the transition I'm going to make is, how did St. Andrews navigate and adapt? When you think about the sustainability, the ambiguity, but also, some of you may know my friend Akil Bello on Twitter. The term highly rejective. You guys for the UK are quite highly rejective as well.
We're very selective.
Right.
Yes.
So that's how I'm going to launch this last discussion. And as you think about your answer, my friend Vaishnavi has written me a note to ask me to acknowledge the virtual audience, because we have a significant virtual audience, and that when we move to question and answer, they're going to get the first question. So put your question in the chat, all of you who have joined virtually. Thank you, Vaishnavi, for reminding me of that. But Candace, go ahead.
I have my director watching virtually too, I'm sure. So I think navigating the ambiguity and the selectivity of our... A little bit louder, is that better? Okay. Navigating the ambiguity, navigating the selectivity, because bumper crop also means our selectivity effectively increased, because we are very finite in space. And so it was the 44, 45 IBs on programs that had minimum of 36. The 44s were getting the offers. That's how much more competitive or selective it became. And for the UK, because of that stress on the personal statement and the reference, it's always been contextual or subjective in that sense. So for us, again, it's been about communicating the process we use, having our policies available so people can go in and understand, trying to be as transparent as possible, and being as accessible so when people have questions, when they want that feedback, we can explain. But it's, in addition to their application, they are competing with the rest of the students who applied. And so it's helping them understand, there's that context as well as the context for each individual application. There's the whole applicant pool context. And so it's, if there's a finite number of spaces, only some people can get in. But when it also comes to that personal statement, that adds a layer that, it is academically focused, but it means it's not just about grades. It's got to be about the quality of the application as well as the fit. And so I think, again, it's been about the relationships. It's been about communicating that process and being as accessible so we can help both manage the expectations at the beginning and then answer the questions and the concerns at the end.
Anything for you guys to add as we close out? We're going to go to questions in the next minute, but I want to give Satya and Alex a chance to build on that as I look at our audience questions from online. So talking about how you're adapting.
So you're asking us to kill time, got it. So I really resonate with the ambiguity piece, because I think again, I'll use USC as an example here. With 70,000 students, the incoming class is supposed to be 3,200. When I worked there, it was never under 34. So we consistently over-enrolled by a couple hundred, if not several hundred students each year. Housing hated us, but the deans were happy with the extra revenue, back to Satya's point. With respect to ambiguity, I think, when institutions are making decisions, and I'll use a recent example here, 3 weeks before we were supposed to send out admission letters, we got a directive from the president's office that they wanted to increase international student admission to the university by 50%. So you can imagine, I'm under the understanding that we're building an international class of 1,000, and then I have to, in 3 weeks, make it 1,500. So I mention this, that we think we know what we know, and then we don't, in a short amount of time. And I think that is, I think, something that, obviously we couldn't go out and blast this news out to counseling communities and say, hey, by the way, this is what's happening. We just had to do it. And so, and there's many, many reasons why institutions are doing that, or have done that to fears of, yield, fears of summer melt, these types of things. And so the other kind of layer to this is this idea of institutional kind of priorities, and how institutions, I'll use Rice as an example. I have a new president, I have a new provost. When you have two senior leadership positions like that change, that changes all the downstream pieces as well. So again, you think as a division you're heading in one direction, and you have a change in leadership and you actually start moving in another direction. And so that's ambiguity. That's the uncertainty, I think, of the institutions, especially the last 2 years, as presidents, provosts have retired because they're burnt out. And the folks who are in the enrollment management positions have to then decipher and interpret previous policies and new expectations moving forward. And so it doesn't sometimes make sense to you all, and it also doesn't make sense to us on the university side sometimes as we're trying to navigate these changes. And so I think for us in enrollment management, we like consistency. We like data sets that show consistency across the years, because we can do things and we can point to things that we've done that have changed that. So adding variability into that is something that we don't like, because then it becomes hard to say, well, it's because of this initiative or this change in policies why one particular market or one particular region is up, is down, so on and so forth. And so I introduced that into the conversation, not because it's, I don't think, anything actionable, but relevant, I think, in the context of the conversation.
So our first question online, that's a great transition. And the first question will go to you, Satya, because it is about, there's a very specific question about co-op options. I'm going to broaden it a bit regarding opportunities for experiential learning and employability. So the specific question I want you to answer is, are co-op options open to masters and post-grad students? But I would like for you also to talk to OPT options. And then Candice, if you could talk about what's different in the UK regarding that. But start with you, Satya.
Yeah, so I am an American citizen now, but I went to the States. I was an Indian citizen. It took me 18 years to go from becoming an Indian citizen to becoming an American citizen. Some days I wonder if it was worth it or not. We'll find out. But for a lot of international students, you have to go through a lot to get just a job in the States. And a lot of institutions will say that we won't even take you for a co-op or an internship if you're an international student, because we have to sponsor your H-1B visa. So at Northeastern, we've made a very conscious effort, both at the undergrad level and the graduate level, that international students get co-ops at the same rate as domestic students. And if an employer is not going to sponsor their H-1B, for which you first have to get an OPT, which is optional practical training, we discourage them from even taking them in a co-op, because you're then giving false hope to an international student who then starts a co-op and then wants a job at that place and then doesn't get one. So that's something for Indian students, for any international student, is very important, because if they want to stay in the States and get a job, the co-op is a gateway into that. And we are very mindful of making sure that students get the OPT and then the H-1B is sponsored by the company. And again, it's not just for undergrad, we do the same for graduate. In quite honesty, we have fewer co-op options for graduate right now, but we're building that at Northeastern.
And Candice, how is the UK different, particularly to Scotland?
A lot. Partly because we lost it and then it came back. So we had it up until 2011, and then it was taken away UK-wide. And so now that it's been reintroduced, we've just completed the first year. of students that would have been eligible for it. And so there's an education process happening with employers. I think particularly in Scotland, we're a small to medium-sized enterprise country. So we don't have big corporations. So you've got smaller companies that aren't going to have the HR staff, may only have a small group, and so you've actually got the owner who started the company who's trying to do the HR process, and so navigating the immigration side of sponsoring and things like that, it discourages them from doing it. So I think that now that we have the post-study work visa back, it's helpful because it's part of the student visa. And the student does not have to have a job tied to it. So they can, as they're graduating, apply for the visa and then stay on and then look for work or continue to look for work. I think particularly for postgrad, if they're undergrad, they've been there for 4 years, at least in Scotland, 3-4 years in the UK. For postgrad, it's going to be harder because they've got 12 months. So they really need to start almost before they start their program. But because they don't have to have an offer that's tied to it, they can go ahead and get it, be able to stay in, and then work on it, and then give themselves that extra time. And the sponsorship then, kind of like with the H-1B, is then the next struggle. And so there's a lot that the Scottish government as well as the UK government is doing to try to educate employers on what the process is like. There are some incentives that they're trying to give to encourage the employers to do it. But now that it's back, we're trying to understand the data, who's going, where the students are going when they get the jobs, and so understand what the trends are, and then where we need to plug in to support both the students and the employers. And the other trend I was going to say that I'm seeing is almost an internationalization of career advising. Because only about 38-40% of the students will stay in the UK. The international students, most will go home from all different countries. And so it's helping them with that job search.
Right.
It's helping them leverage the alumni there. It's helping them network there. And so that's one of our team that's based here, that's something that they're helping with, is helping them make connections with employers here, because they know most of our students from India are coming back to India.
Right.
And a lot of them will want to eventually. Some will stay on, but some won't. Most will come back. And so it's helping them have that and explore it while
And
they're
that's the spirit in the U.S. That's the spirit of the exchange visa, in that the F, which is for undergrad, well, and grad, but that they do return and that they have the connections, the skill sets, and it's a part of our public diplomacy. I want to open the floor for questions. We have about 15 minutes. Yes.
Good morning. I wanted to understand, international students are really a part of the diversity of the university. And how are the cases of affirmative action in, the Harvard case and the University of North Carolina case in the Supreme Court? Will it also affect eventually how domestic admissions happen in the US, but also how international admissions happens if the cases, if diversity is sort of moved out as a
Right.
principle?
So you're referring to there's two Supreme Court cases, one with a private university, you might
Harvard.
have heard of it, Harvard, yeah. I think they're in a football league.
Ivy.
Yeah, that's it. I always forget. And the other is University of North Carolina. Those courts have been separated. You use the term affirmative action. The legal term is actually not about affirmative action, not to be too technical, but it's race-conscious admissions, so looking at race. Would you,
I'll take a stab.
Yeah,
I don't know if it'll be any good, but we'll see what it does. Yeah, so the defined distinction here is race-conscious admission. Universities typically have wide agency in its recruitment practices to go out and recruit and have, as long as it's inclusive, you're not turning away students because of protected classes, race and ethnicity being one of them. We were given wide latitude. This may change in a recent case. And the timeline here is that oral arguments, I believe, are in October, November, so in a couple of months, with decisions, judgments going to be in the spring. I think typically May, June is when Supreme Court releases its, you're shaking your head, you're nodding your head, Jess, I think that's right. So universities are in the process literally right now of gaming out what do our practices look like. This is to that earlier point of strategy and trying to kind of get ahead of the curve here. It depends on how far the Supreme Court goes, on how much they say we can or can't go out and both in the recruitment process and in the selection process. There is a very, very high kind of level of burden that universities have to demonstrate when we are selecting students around race and ethnicity. In fact, most universities typically employ a race-neutral approach in its selection process. And so it's unknown if international students, the classification, I am hopeful that it's not. I think because a lot of conversation is very specific to race and ethnicity, and I doubt any university on this, certainly on this panel and most that I work with, are dialing in on the ethnicity or race of the student, more so the geographic representation, again, which the Supreme Court has given on universities quite a lot of latitude to select on. Is geographic representation, is diversity in a class, not necessarily because they're an Indian citizen or a Chinese national or a Somalian citizen. We come to the conversation because they are international, not because of their race and ethnicity of their home country.
That's a great answer. Would you like to add anything?
Is the session being recorded?
I think it is.
Oh, I'll pass.
Yeah, yeah. And there are a number of resources. So our partners at NACAC offer resources with other organizations to help universities navigate this. And those resources are informed by lawyers, which we are not.
I'll just add one thing. So this is a microcosm of, I think, what the bigger issue is, which is lack of transparency in admission decision making. So I think the question that is being asked, let's put this case aside from all of you and from others, is how do you make a decision? Because sometimes when a decision lands, it's very difficult to explain why was the student accepted or denied, because it's holistic. And holistic is great, but I think a lot of people want some clarity or some kind of guidelines on define holistic a little bit more for us. So I do think that questioning will continue until admissions offices are able to provide that. I just think it's very difficult when like you said, we get 70,000 plus applications and you have 1,500 spots. Sometimes it's very difficult to quantify. So that's where the stress is coming from.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to add quickly to this point about international students being classified as international students and not necessarily by a race or ethnicity. In fact, the US federal government mandates that we report as institutions, and international students' race is not reported as their race, it's reported as international. And so that is quite different in the landscape when we're looking at international students, because it is always based on citizenship rather than based on a particular race. Of course, certainly we are considering in the review process that we're bringing in a diverse international class as well, but even at the census data that we report as institutions, an international student's race is international, so.
Great point.
Hi. I had a question about the co-op. If the increase in co-op, has there been any effect on the student visa issuance? Because if the student even by mistake mentions OPT, CPT, or internship in the visa interview, there's most likely going to be a visa denial. So has there been any trend on more co-op or anything to do with visa issuance?
No, I think we're very careful to make sure that, and again, our visa rates are continuing to be very high. So because it's an academic experience, the co-op is not seen as a negative thing. And we can chat later. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but so far it hasn't impacted us negatively at all.
Yes, please.
Hi, and thank you to everybody on the panel. I just had a question around how do you view privilege as part of college applications? Privilege, yeah. If someone can take a stand on it, please. Thank you.
We don't really see that because we don't see, and at least in the UK, where particularly if they've used UCAS, we don't have family income information, and we can appreciate you may be coming from a great school, but that doesn't necessarily mean that student is coming from privilege. So I think it's something that's, and it's the scholarship process and things like that is also separate. So it's not connected. So we wouldn't know if you needed money or not, if the student needed money or not. So I don't know that.
From an evaluation piece, I tell my team, we're not in the business of hardship hunting. I'm not looking for trauma. I'm not looking for hardship. Hardship exists in many different areas of a student profile, as does privilege. And so that is back to the point of contextual review and the kind of the comprehensiveness of this is it's neither a good thing or a bad thing. It is just a statement of this person does or doesn't have certain privileges in areas of their application. And so when we're training our teams, we want to be mindful of ways in which a student has experienced privilege or has experienced hardship and how that may or may not affect our understanding of the way that they have been able to articulate themselves in an application. But to view privilege, I think, in a way that is seen as a negative is actually a disservice to the student because you're not then acknowledging the opportunity that a student has or hasn't had. And so I think in the admission practices that I've worked in, it is just it is a factor, but it's not a factor in which is done or reviewed in a positive or negative light. It just is a matter of fact.
And having worked at 3 very selective institutions, I think there's a romance and reality of admissions review. I think from the outside it seems like a very romantic process where we sit around for hours and debate about each student. The reality also is that given the volume of applications, I think we spend typically about 15 to 20 minutes per application, and then the deeper, we do have debates, but that doesn't happen for every application. And quite candidly, I think privilege is just something that, of all the things to worry about, is just something we haven't yet kind of, it's not been a factor yet. But I understand the question, and I think it's something we would love to talk through, but just the reality is that we're not there yet.
Yeah, we had a whole session earlier this week, in fact, with Sudarshana, with Evelyn, on globalizing, understanding inclusion and access through a global lens. And we ran out of time then. It was so deep in terms of the discussion. But I think we can say that all of these universities are committed to a community that is inclusive, and that can mean different things in different contexts. I see 2 hands there. Let's start with you on the right. Yes.
When it comes to even equity in terms of understanding scholarships, very often we as counselors, we find it difficult when students have not made it to their dream college and really want to get into studying in the US or UK for that matter. And the question that gets asked is, can I take a transfer thereafter? And so do you advise on transfer, number one? Secondly, are transfer students also eligible for co-op options and also scholarships for that matter? So anything on that?
My advice on transfer is don't come to an institution with the intent on transferring out. So don't take a spot at an institution regardless of what happened, with the chance I'll be there for a year and then I'll go somewhere else, because you're doing a disservice to the institution and to someone else who could have had that experience. But if you genuinely come to an institution and it's just not working out, then I think transfer is fine, and I think it's encouraged, because you don't want to be unhappy for 4 years. But I always tell students, don't come in. And again, at Northeastern, we never differentiate between a transfer student or otherwise in terms of co-ops or scholarships. But I'll be honest with you, scholarships are fewer, just overall, but we want to make sure that every student gets an equal opportunity. But I guess the big takeaway is don't come to an institution with the intent of leaving in a year.
Yeah, they would have, and the only exception to that, I would say, and Alex, I know at USC, you have a lot of transfers from community colleges. So 2-year institutions, associate degree programs are great pathways to different types of institutions, usually more public institutions like the UCs have great articulation policies, but I know USC, Rice, Northeastern receives those as well. Yes, and correct. And among U.S. community colleges, international students at those community colleges transfer at 90% rate. I mean, so it's a very high rate of successful transfer to a 4-year. Yes, please.
Hi. You talked a little bit about transparency, and I know that the admit rates have really gone down, but how can we find out more about the more admit rate specifics to international students? Because when we're working with students and they see the admit rate overall, there's so much inside of that data, and I don't want them to necessarily be a number point, but I also want them to have good information, because maybe the admit rate for international went down, or maybe it went up because of institutional priorities, and that's a whole different conversation. But to have some other metrics to work from besides just this one, because there's so much of the domestic student, if you're a public school, or in-state and out-of-state, that are factored in. Could you comment on that? Some schools put it out, but more information.
I can jump in because I think it's something I can appreciate because of my background, but it's something, from where I'm coming from, Scotland, UK doesn't do that. We don't put up that sort of thing because it's so specific to the nationality, the curriculum, and the program they're applying to. So I'd have to give you the admissions rate, or the offer rate, for Indians who did CBSE applying to management. Yeah. If I'm really, so I can give you kind of the overall overseas, but there's so much, like you said, there's so much within that it's just a generic number. The kind of thing we tend to encourage students is, because at that point, if you're looking at offer rates, if you're looking at rankings, you're trying to hedge your bets. And what's going to be the ROI? Am I likely to get in so that I can then benefit from that ROI? And they're not looking at employment. They're not looking at alumni network. They're not looking at the student experience. We have a student satisfaction survey in the UK that asks students, did you enjoy your experience? Did you enjoy working with your professors? And it breaks it all down like that. And those are the kind of things we say, go talk to the students. Like that's, at the end of the day, going back to the question about transfer and things like that, maybe it's not the first, but doesn't mean you're not going to love the second one that you went to. So maybe you go to that second one because you're planning to try to transfer and do that, but you actually end up loving it. And so I think usually what we say is actually look at the experience. What is the student experience going to be like? Because the offer rate's only giving you one insight into one particular way to look at it.
It's so contextual. It often depends. Yeah. And Alex, Satya, I'm assuming you guys don't release data on international admit rates. The UC system does, so that's one place that you can get that. I want to be respectful of your time and for your break in the next session. I've already taken 2 minutes over my time, but I want to give a chance for you to, I want to express gratitude for such a dynamic and engaged audience. Thank you for sticking with us in this conversation. And I'd like to thank our panelists. Everybody wave. I'm going to take a picture that we can put on Twitter.
Can I make one statement? So
okay,
I've done a lot of panels with Clay, and I'm usually the minority in the room, so it's really nice to be here where Clay is the minority. So it's one, and the second one is I've actually been helping Clay pronounce Indian names. So Sudarshana, he came to me as he said, Sudarshana. I said, who is that person? He said, so I've been helping out, and I have to notice, so his name is Ankur.
Encore.
Yeah, I thought his name was Encore, like Encore. He said, I have an employee called Encore. I said, that's very interesting. So, yeah, so there you go. So.
I'm trying. It's only my 30th time to India. You would think my southern accent would.
I just learned how to pronounce correctly tikka. Because I've been saying tikka, like chicken tikka. Like that.
Let's give another round of applause to these guys. We'll stay up front if you have additional questions, but I wanted to be respectful of time. Thank you, everyone.